can maybe say that, but this is not really detailed. It's not really easy to do that, right? So, and that's a challenge. That's a problem. So we can't really do that. And this is what the Viable Map book is actually about, to be really having a tool, a method to be able to explain this. And there's a similar area where this was always also the problem. So that's the topic. And this is a little side note, the idea of a business model. So maybe you are familiar with the concept of a business model. So there's also a business model canvas. Maybe you have seen this also, where we have a one-pager on which we can basically describe what is the business model of an organization. So before this arrived in 2010, this idea of a canvas, we probably also thought about, okay, companies have different business models, right? So some of them may be doing this, I don't know, selling products in a very transactional way. Some others do this through subscriptions, for example. Some companies have a particular way to reach their customers, a particular sales channel, particular relationships. Others choose different ways to do this. So we kind of knew there's a difference, but we couldn't really well describe it or even change that for our organization until this innovation about the canvas, just to map it and to visualize in a very easy to understand way what is a business model. And this was an innovation in its own right? Just to be able to allow companies and people to workshop what's my business model. For example, if you want to create a startup, then you kind of have an idea, you have a vision of your startup, but you don't know how you create value, how you capture value, and how you deliver value. But the business model canvas will help you to do that. Okay, so and that's already well, a great tool that is really helpful for people in understanding what is their business model. So how an organization relates to its external environment. So the same thing we also have for a management model. So as I mentioned, we struggle to describe that, right? We don't really know, well, there's a difference in organizations, how they're managed, but we can't really describe how that happens. So the management model is basically everything that happens inside the organization. So how do we manage ourselves? And there is a quote that I'm sharing here, which says, a management model is the choices made by a company's top executives, maybe the C-suite, regarding how they define objectives, how they motivate the effort of people, how they coordinate activities, and how they allocate resources. In other words, how they define the work of management, right? So if you think about, you have a challenge of managing an organization with 50 people, 100 people, 500 people, 10,000 people, whatnot. That's a challenge, right? You need to kind of set up a way of doing things around here. And that we describe as the management model. So there are management models for entire organizations. So for example, for Spotify, for Unilever, for Kraft Heinz, right? So they all have their management model. But these tasks that you see here, you also have them at your level. Let's say you are only running a business model or a business unit, or a team or a department. As a manager, you always have these challenges, right? You need to set objectives for your people in your team. You need to motivate them. You need to coordinate their activities, and you need to allocate their resources, right? So you have these challenges at all levels in the environment, in the organization, So that's what we say is a management model. Okay, so I hope that's clear. So and this is very much related to beyond budgeting, and you'll see that in a bit. So then the question is, what management models actually exist right now? And there is the one management model that we're all familiar with, and we can call this the command and control management model. Okay, so and that we can say the command and control management model is created through the way we budget. Okay, so the way we budget traditionally, we can call this traditional budgeting. You could think, okay, this is just a way of doing a management control practice, accounting. You can say, well, this is just some work that somebody does in the organization who works in the accounting or finance department. But no, this is a very central and crucial process for the management of any organization. Okay, as we've just seen, right? And management model here would mean that through traditional budgets, we actually set objectives to the organization. Okay, we allocate resources to the organization, we coordinate activities, and we motivate and reward people on this, right? So a traditional budget does a lot of these things. And the idea here is saying that, well, the way we practice traditional budgeting has big implications about the entire management model of an organization, right? So the way you run budgeting has an influence on the culture also of your organization, on the entire management model. Yeah? And we would say that there's a lot of criticism also against traditional budgeting, because you can say it's like a fixed performance contract. Yeah? So you budget only for the next year that's around the corner. Maybe if you have a financial year from January to December, you budget in fall, perhaps, for the next financial year, for the next January to December. So that's a very fixed period only, and you assume that the world stops maybe afterwards, right? So that's a problem, right? The targets are very much fixed. So you believe you can set a target up to 15, 16 months in advance, even though there's a lot of uncertainty. Then you allocate resources very, very early, 16 months earlier. And even though if there's a new project coming along down the road in the next financial year, you cannot really fund this project because you already allocated the resources way too early, okay? Then you do a monthly control, right, where you say, okay, what is my budget numbers? And I'm going to compare it maybe in the end of February with my actual numbers. And then I'm going to ask, okay, did I perform, yes or no? The rewards are predetermined. So most people, because there's a lot of negotiation about the target, they know in advance what they need to do in order to get a particular reward or bonus. So then they also have a tendency to negotiate those numbers down, which is a problem, because then most of your energy is not about making customers happy or developing new products or becoming more sustainable, but it's really about how can I negotiate my goals down, right? And so that's a huge problem in the organization. And then it has to be signed off, right? So it's a very hierarchical process. Okay, so this is the idea of traditional budgeting leading to a command and control type of management model. Okay, but this is what we are all very familiar with, because that's the traditional way of how organizations get managed. Okay, so we are very familiar with this type of management model. Now, I already mentioned a few of the problems of traditional budgeting, and maybe just to kind of show that again. So what's the problem? I've already mentioned this. One is that we have a lot of gaming behavior, right? So let's say your boss says, okay, now it's budgeting time again. Can you please tell me what you believe is a realistic revenue number if you're a sales manager? And if you know that whatever number you say will come back as a target, and all your resources are attached to it, then you have different incentives, right? So if it comes back as a target, you have an incentive to lowball this number, to say, oh, my sales will look very bad in the next year. So I have no incentive to actually say the actual realistic number. So I'm really gaming my behavior, right? I'm lowballing my numbers. Sometimes I could also have the incentive to say, in particular, a very high number, because maybe I only say this high number so that I can get more resources, maybe a new salesperson to join my team or whatnot, right? So there's a problem here. Right? We have a lot of dysfunctional gaming behavior. Second, budgets are extremely inflexible, right? So once the budget is prepared, some companies take 3 months, 6 months to do that. Yeah, it's kind of rigid, it's fixed. Yeah, and if then there's a big event happening, for example, the pandemic, right? So nobody budgeted for the pandemic, but then in February 2020, March 2020, we were all surprised. We had to shut down operations. And then this event, well, what do we do? It's not in the budget. Should we then rebudget, spend another 3 or 5 months to kind of come up with a budget? What should we do, right? So the budgets are extremely inflexible. So that's the second big problem. And also, we use them a lot as a guidepost for performance, as I mentioned, right? If I have my actual performance come in, let's say at the end of Q1, I may compare that to what I budgeted. But if the budget is wrong to begin with, because I cannot foresee the future if there's a lot of uncertainty, well, then my comparison of actual numbers against the budget will also be wrong. And I believe I'm hitting a goal or hitting a budget, but this performance target, this budget was actually wrong to begin with. So in many organizations, we don't really have a way to understand what is performance. And fourth, we have a lot of bureaucracy and cost. So I mentioned already, it takes some organizations 3 to 6 months or whatever to come up with their budget. So you're spending a lot of energy of people for numbers, a set of numbers, which are potentially outdated already by January 1st. So that's another problem. So if you listen to me right now, you could say, oh, well, that's interesting. So why don't companies move away from this command and control type of management, right? So if there are so many problems, so many issues, yeah, of ineffectiveness and of inefficiency, yeah? So these are both seen as big problems. And indeed, there's a lot of people who actually said, we need to move away from this. We need to go beyond budgeting. And this is also why we have this term beyond budgeting, yeah? Because the innovators of this idea, these are two gentlemen by the name of Jeremy Hope and Robin Fraser. So they were both from the UK. One was a finance expert who became a book author, and the other one was a partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers, which is a big four auditing and consulting firm. So they really saw the problems that traditional budgeting created in organizations, and then they said, "This is not possible, right? We need to have different ways to manage our organizations." So then they said, okay, we need to go look beyond budgeting. Yeah? So what lies beyond? What lies on the other side? If we don't do budget, what could we do instead, right? So that became sort of the working title of their project back in the late 90s. Yeah? And eventually this also became the name of their management innovation, right? Which was then called Beyond Budgeting. Yeah? And the innovation of Beyond Budgeting had different taglines. Now the tagline is performance the right way. Yeah. Last year, the tagline was enabling business agility. And there were at different point in times, different taglines, just to show basically what Beyond Budgeting is about. So what's important here is, even though the name is Beyond Budgeting, it's not a budgeting or accounting innovation. It's really, we're intending here the entire management model. That's what they mean here, even though the word budgeting kind of makes it assume that this is only a thing for the finance community, yeah? But it's really the whole management model. We have to go beyond budgets, right? So this could be interesting also for CEOs, for people interested in the management model, for HR, right? So, and that's how you should understand this. The claim is, if you do Beyond Budgeting, you will create an organization which is much more adaptive. Or in the last many years, we are using, instead of the word adaptive, we use the word agile. Then we will also become more empowered, meaning people in the organization will have much more authority to take and make decisions. They're much more empowered, and that's typically great. Organizations are more human, they're better places to work, and organizations are performing better. So there's also a performance claim. So what Jeremy Hope and Robin Fraser did is they actually visited lots of companies who did something special. They didn't do traditional budgeting, but they did something different. So they visited all these companies and wrote their first book in 2003, which was published in the Harvard Business School Press, sharing basically the examples and experiences of these best practice companies that did something which was not traditional budgeting. Then they kind of synthesized the experiences of all these companies and created a set of principles, which is now known as Beyond Budgeting. And I'm going to show this in a bit. Okay, so that was the first big publication, was the book in Harvard Business School Press in 2003. And ever since, we have lots of articles, we have lots of other books, which kind of push the model forward, which create new examples, new ways of managing, right? Which are all kind of related to Beyond Budgeting, right? So now, today, there's a lot of companies that are on the journey, right? So you will see later on how if you change your management model, this is not something that you do within 2 weeks. It's not like you don't call a consultant and say, hey, can you please do this? And then they will change your management model. No. Changing a management model, it's kind of ingrained in the entire organization. If you want to change it, this is probably a longer term, what we call journey, right? This will take you a few months. It's important that you have a vision of where you want to go, but what you do on the way to get there is very idiosyncratic. It's about your organization, about your people, about your environment, and it's your own journey that you have. So here are some firms, some logos of firms, and that are claiming that they are a Beyond Budgeting organization, that they're sort of on the journey, right? So I'm not sure if you recognize any patterns here. Do you think this is maybe only good for some companies and not for others? Does anyone recognize patterns? Yeah, so that was maybe a rhetorical question, just to encourage you to think. So the idea here is there is no pattern, right? So you see actually companies from all sorts of geographies. So you see European companies, Asian companies, North American companies, South American companies, right? So there's any sort of geography. Then there's any sort of sector, right? So this could be services organizations, manufacturing organizations, financial organizations, really any sort of organization from any sector, and also any size. So this could be very large, big corporations. For example, you see here Roche and Bayer. These are big pharmaceutical companies. Volvo is a car maker, right? Equinor is the largest Scandinavian organization in oil and gas or energy. So very big organizations, but then you also see small companies. That are maybe just 50 or 100 people, small services companies, IT companies, right? So you also see public companies, companies that are listed on the stock exchange, and you see also private companies, family-owned businesses, right? So it's really there's something in beyond budgeting for anyone, right? It's a management model any sort of organization could pick, including, and you see this also here, public sector organizations, right? So you see the public sector also being very interested in having a better, let's say, management model. So why would these organizations actually go towards beyond budgeting? What's the motivation for them? So there could be one motivation, and I already said it, which is I'm really unhappy and dissatisfied with my current budgeting practice. I really don't like the culture this creates, this gaming behavior. I don't like the bureaucracy. I don't like its inflexibility. I'm really fed up with it. So we have a lot of people in the finance function who say, okay, we need to really change something. This is not okay this way, right? So especially in our environments today, we have to do something different, okay? A second motivation for you to change could also be that you have a particular type of people in the organization, right? And there's a theory that maybe you have heard before. It's the theory X versus theory Y by Douglas McGregor from the 1960s, who said there are basically two types of people. So one type of person is the theory X type of person. And this we can say is a person who prefers to be directed, who does not want responsibility, who has little to no ambition, doesn't really like work, and will avoid it whenever possible. So we need to coerce them, steer them, direct them, tell them what they should be doing. So that's a theory X type of person. I'm sure there is no one of you in this room, in this call, who is a theory X person, right? We are all very different. That's the second type of person, maybe theory Y type of person. And these are people who, as you see, will enjoy working, right? They think it's like play. It's something that they really enjoy doing, right? So they will be self-directed. They will be creative, ingenious, innovative, doing their work. They want to have responsibility and they want to improve by themselves. So that's a different type of person, a theory Y type of person. So if you ask leaders in an organization or the HR function, what type of people do you want to employ? If you are in a knowledge-based organization, most answers will probably be, yeah, of course, I want to employ theory Y type of people. Because in a knowledge-based society or organization, we need these people because we need to be innovative, creative, and reinvent the organization. Also, we can say the young generation of today, there's a word, we sometimes use the word Generation Z. So the people who nowadays are 20 years old, so they really will prefer joining an organization which has a great purpose, for example, which is a very human organization where you can take a lot of responsibility, where you're very empowered, right? So in order to attract these types of people, maybe then you also should change your management model, okay? So that's one or a second motivation after your dissatisfaction with your traditional budgeting process. Another reason why you could change, and this is a metaphor that I took from a very important author in Beyond Budgeting by the name of Bjarte Buxnes, who led the transformation at the company Equinor. So he has this great metaphor where he says, doesn't it also depend on the environment that you find yourself in, how you manage? So he uses this metaphor of traffic flow. So imagine your job is to manage traffic in your city, and then you have two ways to do this. One, you see this here, is you have a traffic light. So basically the traffic light will tell people when to stop and when to drive. And the other option is you could have a roundabout. Now, the question is, these two different ways of managing traffic flow, who is in control in these situations? Yeah? And for the traffic light, who is in control? Well, the person who programmed the traffic light, maybe in 1985, when the crossing was inaugurated. Yeah, so it's a person that is not currently in the situation. Based on what information was this traffic light programmed? Well, based on the information of traffic flow in 1985. Yeah? Now, going to the other example, the roundabout. Who is in control in the roundabout of traffic flow? Who's controlling traffic flow in the roundabout? Yeah, maybe you have that answer. Yeah, it's the drivers, right? Every driver, him or herself, will be in control of traffic flow because they decide if they enter the traffic flow very quickly, or where they stop, because there's traffic inside, right? And they do this based on which information? Well, based on the current information, the current reality they see on the ground, right? So it's very real time. And sometimes, for example, if it's late at night, you're coming back from the airport and then there's no traffic, you can go very quickly through it. Otherwise, if it's rush hour in the morning, well, then you rather stop and let others pass. So two ways of managing. And we can say, well, this depends a bit on the environment you have. On the one hand side, with a traffic light, you have a very stable environment. You can really foresee it easily. You can use a rules-based tool, and that's pretty easy, and maybe less efficient. So that's one way of doing things. The other thing is you maybe have an environment which we can call VUCA. And this, maybe you've heard this. It's a term that we very often use to describe our environments. A VUCA environment is one that is volatile, that is going up and down, that is uncertain. So we don't know what's going to happen. Examples are, we are in very VUCA times right now. So we've had the economic crisis in 2008, 2009. We had, well, in particular in Europe, we had Brexit, for example. Then we had the pandemic, obviously. And now we have the invasion of Ukraine, which has huge consequences on, well, world politics, on inflation, right? So these are extremely VUCA times. It's very uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen. Also, the world is very complex. So it's not so easy to understand how things work, how prices get developed, right? How competition will act, right? And it's very ambiguous. So this is the acronym for VUCA, right? And in these environments, it's perhaps not possible to manage with a traffic light, but we have to manage as a metaphorical way in a roundabout, right? So we have to, as a leader, we have to make sure that people follow certain values. And in this metaphor, what would be the values? The values are that, well, drivers acquire a driving license where they kind of understand what's at stake when you're driving. So safety of people, how the car works, what's the laws, the traffic laws of the country. And then you also have some signs. You have traffic signs, and these are basically your values. But within those values, you're basically free and open and self-regulated. You decide yourself what needs to be done, right? And this is probably a bit more difficult, but it's probably also most efficient in a VUCA environment. Okay, so that's a nice metaphor. So another motivation to change and to do beyond budgeting would be maybe your environment that you find yourselves in. So now we haven't still seen what is beyond budgeting. What does it look like? And I mentioned already that Jeremy Hope and Robin Fraser said, we are unhappy with the way traditional budgeting creates command and control organizations. So what they did is they visited other firms and looked at their practices. And the result was that they came up with a set of 12 principles, which they said, okay, this is beyond budgeting, right? So, and important, what I want to mention is, this is principles, okay? So this is not, it's not a rule, or it doesn't say you have to do this, right? So it's formulated as a principle. So if you look at this, let's take this one right here. So there's 12. The first one, for example, says purpose. So purpose is part of your management model. And the idea is you should engage and inspire people around bold and noble causes, but not around short-term financial targets. Right? So you see, it's not like a rule. It doesn't say you have to do this, you have to pick this purpose. It just says, find for yourself a particular purpose, whatever it is, Yeah, but you just have to understand why you do this. And this is why it's a principle. So it's a principles-based way. So you have to ask yourself for your organization, what could be a purpose for me, right? I kind of understand I shouldn't, the purpose cannot be or should not be a short-term financial target, but I have to have a purpose. For example, a university will have a purpose often of educating people, right? And I don't know, offering free programs, scholarships, right? Offering education to people, allowing people to get great jobs, right? So this could be purposes of a university, right? But the purpose is not, I'm going to pay faculty or program managers with a variable bonus or something like that. Okay, so that's the first thing I would like to mention, that beyond budgeting is a set of purposes. Another thing I'd like to mention is that beyond budgeting consists of two parts. Yeah, we see this, we have the leadership principles and we have management processes. Okay, and this is very crucial because for people in beyond budgeting, a management model is exactly this. So it consists of those two things. It consists of leadership principles and management processes. And the idea here is they should be aligned. They should be thought in coherence. Yeah. And on the right side, you see management processes. So this is where we start in a budgeting practice or process, right? So these are the management processes. So how do I set targets? How do I do forecasting? How do I allocate resources, evaluate performance, give rewards, and how do I coordinate? So this is what typically a traditional budgeting process does. But in beyond budgeting, we try to say the way you do this needs to change. So you don't have, as in traditional budgeting, fixed and cascaded targets, but you will actually have directional, ambitious, and ideally relative goals. And you have the management processes and the leadership principles, as I said, they should be in alignment or in coherence. So I just want to maybe say one thing. So I've mentioned already the word agile, and I'm not sure if any one of you is familiar with agility, the way you develop digital products. I mean, there's a particular way of doing this. This is where the word agile comes from. So this community, so all the people who are trying to create agile organizations, very digitalized organizations where they're creating products, they are really interested in beyond budgeting because they say, oh, this is very similar to what we are trying to achieve. Yeah. So in agile, we are trying to say, okay, we need to have a small team in agile. Yeah. If you develop agile products, yeah, if you have a small team, then you want to be focused on customers. So you need to be customer centric. And if you have lots of small teams, you need to figure out a way to kind of organize in a network. Okay. So people who are interested in agile, in kind of digitalizing companies, making them more agile, they oftentimes realize, oh, there's this traditional budgeting process that totally blocks my way of creating a more agile organization. But when they look at beyond budgeting, they're really interested because they see, oh, they're also talking about small teams. They're talking here in organization about having small accountable teams. So that's great. So that's the same thing I want in agility and digitalization, right? They also talk about being customer centric because here there's a principle on being customer centric. And that's exactly what I want, right? I want to have products that delight customers. And third, if I want to have an organization with very many small teams, I need to create a network around it. And to have the network self-regulate itself, we need a lot of open information. We need a lot of transparency, right? So we also have this principle right here. Yeah? So this is now also why this agile community is very much interested in beyond budgeting. Okay, so that's something, a little side note I wanted to share. But then I'd like to also talk about the coherence between those two parts. So we can diagnose what is a management model by looking at this. So imagine you have this, you have a situation where maybe you are, I don't know, let's say you are a full-time student and now it's your final year and you want to get a job, right? I mean, and some of you in the audience can probably relate to this. So let's say you are in the job market, you're looking for a job. Yeah, and then you say, okay, I'm going to go to a career fair. Maybe it's organized by the university. You're going to meet different companies. And these companies all tell you, hey, you should be joining us. it's fantastic to work with us. We trust you. If you work with us, we'll totally trust you. So they will talk about this. And they will say, we're going to work in teams. They're fantastic. Are you a team player? Well, then you should join my company because, I mean, we are all team players, right? So that's what they will say. So we have also shared values. So fantastic. Look at our values. That's so amazing. So then maybe as a student, you say, oh, that's fantastic. That's great. That's exactly the type of organization I'd like to join, right? Now, then you sign the contract. You start working for that company. But then the company says, I'm going to reward you based on a fixed target. So they sit down with you in the first week and say, okay, you started to work. So you're going to be paid based on this goal right here. Here's the fixed target. Okay. So, and that's perhaps a problem, right? Because you're saying, well, this is not in alignment with basically my leadership principles. Okay. So, if I have a fixed target, well, this is maybe not aligned with the values that you have in the organization. Okay, and also it's a fixed and individual target very often. You get your individual bonus, and then you say, well, isn't this in misalignment with what we say here on the leadership side, right? So on the leadership side, the HR person told you, you're going to be a team player. We're going to work in teams. But on the management process side, the process tells you, no, you have an individual bonus, right? So this is a mismatch, right? So, and that's a problem. So this is a management model that is not in alignment, not in coherence, okay? And that's what beyond budgeting would say. Then also, let's imagine you are a salesperson, and then you're going to go travel to a conference somewhere, and then you win a customer. You are so happy. You win this customer. It's fantastic. It's great. Okay, so... and then you go back to the office, and then for a long time, they will bug you and say, well, you went to a restaurant with a customer and you invited this customer and you spend, I don't know, $5 too much on the invitation for the dinner, right? So that's another problem, right? So because they told you, they will trust you. Right? When they hired you, they say, I'll trust you to make the right decisions. And clearly you made the right decision, which is, well, you won a customer, and this customer will bring lots of revenues to you, right? So basically, the management process says we shouldn't do detailed budget allocations. So if you go take a customer to dinner, you only spend this amount of money. But the HR practice said, we're going to trust you, right? So there's a mismatch. So they told you, I'm going to trust you. And this includes you can do whatever you think is best to win the customer. At the same time, the management process says, no, if you do this, you only get paid this amount of money for inviting a customer to dinner. So these are just two examples that show how in many organizations, the management model is broken. There is no alignment. There is no coherence. Okay. So I hope that was sort of clear, right? So now this is the idea of a management model. So it consists of those two parts. And this I mentioned is very unique for Beyond Budgeting because they actually think those two things together. So there's actually a lot of books on leadership principles. If you go to a bookstore at university or in an airport, I mean, you see a lot of books that talk a lot about leadership. We have to be having a purpose as leaders. We have to be decentralized as an organization. And there's a lot of stuff on this, but nobody ever thinks about management processes. How do I have to design my management processes to allow these changes to happen on the leadership side? So the Viable Map book, what that does is actually trying to exactly allow companies to understand their management model better. So in the Viable Map, we said, okay, let's turn these principles on their head. So at the bottom now, we have the leadership principles. At the top, we have management processes. And then we say, okay, if this is your management model, these 12 principles, well, doesn't it depend on the environment that you have? And remember the environment, we said it could be stable, or it could be volatile, right? Volatile was the VUCA environment that we said. Okay, so the management model you have depends really on what is your environment like. And then if you have a very volatile environment, you want to maybe have a very adaptive management model. If you have a stable environment, well, then you can have a very fixed and traditional management model and a command and control management model, perhaps. At the same time, at the bottom, you have the types of people. So who do you employ in the organization? Is it a theory X type of person or a theory Y type of person? And if you have a theory X type of person, well, then maybe you should have a very centralized way of managing, right? Very top-down directives. If you have a theory Y type of people structure, well, then you could be much more distributed, perhaps, okay? So the idea here is then in the Bible map to say, okay, you have to maybe maybe you do a workshop for your own organization, my company, my organization. Let's discuss what is our environment like. Are we more stable? Are we more volatile? What type of people do we have? Do we have X type of people? Do we have Y type of people? So we can workshop this in a room with Post-its, and we can put this map on the wall, and then with Post-its, basically to say, okay, where are we there? And then we say, what does our management model look like for those 12 principles? So how do we set targets? How do we evaluate performance? What's our purpose? How autonomous are people? Where are we on this? So then we can workshop this and place these Post-its on our management model. So this is basically the recent development in Beyond Budgeting, this new methodology to basically map your management model. I hope this became sort of clear. So basically, it's like the canvas for business models. Now we have a canvas or a map to, well, help people to do 4 things about their management model. So the first one is, in general, it allows you to describe what is a management model. And this is basically what I did up to now. I describe what is a management model. So I said it depends on 2 things: leadership principles, management processes, and it depends on the environment and the type of people you have. Then this map allows you to discuss your own organization's management model. So we can actually say, oh, I'm this organization, so what's my management model? Do you agree? So you can do a workshop with 5 or 10 people, and then you can discuss that. So third, you can also diagnose your management model, because maybe as you visualize it, you put things on this map, then you actually see, maybe there is a problem, there is a misalignment. The one I said, for example, so people get individual goals and targets, but people are saying we should be team players. Right? And then you can actually diagnose and realize there's a problem, there's a misalignment, and then maybe you can describe what's the consequence of this misalignment and say, okay, that's really not tolerable. We need to change something. And that's then the 4th thing you can do, which is design. You can then say, okay, I've now understood, diagnosed a misalignment, so now I have to change something. Maybe I should move away from individual targets to maybe team targets or company targets, or to abandoning variable compensation altogether. Okay, so these would be the 4 things that you can do with this viable map. Now, in the book, of course, that we published, this looks a bit prettier. So this is the viable map that you see right here. So, but same content, of course. So you see the management model is basically the set of positions on this map, wherever you are on these 12 principles. Now, budgeting or traditional budgeting with its command and control culture on this map is basically on the very left in the column, fixed for management processes and centralized for leadership principles. So everything on the red, if this is budgeting, and this could be a good way to manage a company if your environment is very stable, stable, understood, simple, and obvious. This is what we coined to say that's the opposite of VUCA. So if you have this environment, and right now I don't see many environments that are like this, but if you have such an environment, it could actually be good if you have a traditional command and control type of management model, if at the same time you also only employ people who are theory X. And that's totally fine, right? But the Bible map, all it does is basically in a neutral stance, explains to you, well, what is your management model? And this would be traditional budgeting. Now, beyond budgeting, by definition, I said beyond budgeting is basically just going beyond on the other side to see what's outside of traditional budgeting. So beyond budgeting is basically any situation on the right to this, because beyond budgeting is not one model; it's a principles-based model, and companies are doing very different things for themselves, right? So that's beyond budgeting, and important. It's a management model, right? It's not just the management processes; it's also the leadership principles. Okay. So that's how we could use that to, well, discuss a management model and to, well, describe my own, right? And important is this idea of the map that says there should be some coherence, or I called it alignment before, right? So we know it's not so important that we are super precise here. So, but what we can see is more or less a model which is in alignment. Yeah, and then that's okay, right? Because if there's alignment, if there's coherence, then people in the organization, they get one message. Yeah? So they don't get one message from HR and management. You have to be a team player, and another message from finance, where it says here is a variable bonus on individual performance, because this confuses people, and this alignment makes the company less performing. So most often, actually, the management process also wins. So oftentimes people in HR, managers, wonder, why does my new purpose, why does nobody follow it? Well, that's because nobody thought about adjusting the management processes up top. So that's the idea of the viable map. So that's basically the new developments. So there's a book that just came out. I have it here with me. It came out like 10 days ago, 2 weeks. And this is basically a very practical workbook that allows you to map your management model, and to also see how you can change it if you want to go towards beyond budgeting. So I'll stop here for now, because I've already talked quite a bit, and ask if there's any questions by anyone about what I just mentioned, or any comments perhaps.
Okay, thank you very much for the explanations, Becker. The introductions of the beyond budgeting. There are some questions here. The first question is that is there a similar concept for better budgeting and also beyond budgeting? Because sometimes, according to the literature, they said that both of them, better budgeting and also beyond budgeting, they use rolling forecasts or no fixed target.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So indeed, in the literature that you see, if it's about budgeting, there's let's say a current of work that says, and they don't say this much anymore right now. This is more like 10, 15 years ago, where they talk about this idea of better budgeting, right? So what is better budgeting? It's basically the idea of saying, yes, I agree. The way we traditionally practice budgets is problematic, right? We don't like the dysfunctions it creates, the inflexibility. We need to do something differently. So then there's a few, quick win solutions of these people. They say, okay, well, to solve the big problem which we have with my command and control management model, I will just implement forecasts. Okay, but if I only implement rolling forecasts, if you think in the map, then you're maybe on a different position for forecasts. But if you don't change anything else, right? If you don't change the way you set targets, the way you allocate resources, this is a quick fix that's not really changing a management model, right? So better budgeting is basically an attempt to change a little bit traditional budgeting, but very few, actually, I haven't seen anything where better budgeting actually is thinking in terms of management models, right? It's just trying to do a finance process a little bit better, but we're not really going to the core of the problem, which is we have ineffective ways of managing.
Okay, thank you very much. And then the second question is, what is the most effective technique to assess a company's readiness to move from the traditional budgeting to beyond budgeting?
Yep, thanks for that question. So I already said what could be a motivation to change, right? So we had 3 motivations, right? We said, okay, we are unhappy with the way we are currently budgeting and the culture consequences it has. Second, we said it depends on the people that you hire. Is it X versus Y? And third, we said it depends on the environment, right? So is it a VUCA environment or a SUSE environment? Now, the question was about the readiness to do this, right? So, of course, if any of these 3 things are very extreme, like you're really having a lot of problems with your budgeting process, all the people you have are super creative, they want to do something different, right? And your environment is so unpredictable, well, then you probably have a lot of people who are unhappy, unsatisfied in the organization with the current management model, right? So then you have a good opportunity to say, we should really do something. And in terms of readiness, I mean, it depends also on people who basically take ownership of saying, okay, I want to understand beyond budgeting, I want to do something different. who then think of, okay, how can I start this? In which pilot of the organization could I do that? Who is going to be the team that tries to change it? Which leaders will support that, right? So if you have individuals who really understand the model, who have a game plan, a way to implement this, this could also be good. But there's no, I mean, you have to really understand your organization to understand that readiness.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to move to the next questions. You explained that the reward for beyond budgeting is against competitions. So how do we set a reasonable relative target setting in beyond budgeting? What is the best method for selecting peers when organizations are benchmarking for performance evaluations? And last but not least, how many peers would be ideal?
Yeah, okay, so that's already a very advanced question. So somebody who understands the idea of relative target setting. So I actually have, let me just show this. So I brought a few slides. So the way we set targets in traditional budgets is always we do it in a very fixed way and negotiate it, right? So you probably know this. Well, you say, okay, we'll sit down in the fall of the year, and then we negotiate, and then we have a fixed target, right? And this is basically our goalpost for performance. And then we have actual data, and we always compare the actual data against this. And this is a problem because if you have uncertain environments, you have a lot of competitive activity, this comparison to the fixed negotiated target is probably not going to tell you what is performance. So beyond budgeting says one way of improving this is to go to relative targets, right? So, and that's what the question was about, to say, well, shouldn't we maybe do something different? And these are different alternatives for relative targets. So you could say, for example, let's improve year after year. So my performance last year was 100%. Well, my target will then be 5% better next year, and then after 5% more. So evergreen targets. And then you say, well, this could be one way of doing relative target setting. So I don't have to spend time and energy on negotiating my target. I can just say, well, the target is always, I don't know, being 5% more cost efficient or having 5% more revenues, right? Because then you can really, you have a different understanding of what is performance. And then, and that was the question was about, you could also say, let's have a benchmark, let's have internal benchmarks. So if you have a bank, for example, with hundreds of branches, you can say, we're going to create little benchmark groups of very comparable branches. And then we can compare these very comparable branches with each other and create a league table where we say, which of those branches did the best job, okay? Or you can say, if I don't want to do this internally, I can do this also externally, where I say, as the question said, I'm going to compare myself with other branches, other banks, or other competitors. And the question was, I mean, what's the best number, right? So, I mean, there's no clear understanding of what is the best number. It's really, is it really a good benchmark? That's most important, right? So, because otherwise people in the organization will say, yeah, you're giving me this benchmark, but I mean, they're so different, right? So you're benchmarking me with an organization which has 5 times more employees, a different pricing structure or whatnot. So the task is really not to find so many, perhaps different ones, but really comparable ones where people don't find excuses to say, no, I'm not comparable at all, right? So it's very easy to do in a multi-site organization. For example, if you have a bank with lots of branches, if you have, I don't know, supermarkets or retail organizations, that's very good to do internal benchmarks. But you can always, in a big organization, always find teams that do the same type of work, right? But it's really finding the best benchmark group. And also organizations sometimes pay money to get this data from the outside because they really believe in this power of saying relative targets is the best, right? So that would be my answer.
Okay, thank you very much. I just want to make it clear. So for the comparable companies itself, does it mean that we have to compare with the similar size for the company itself with the same industry or something like what? Yeah, the term comparable itself. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's also a good question. So if I go into this chart right here, so I just explained already this one, right? I talked about this. I talked about this way. Another way, if it's not comparable size, you could also say I'm going to look at ratios and relative numbers. Right. So, for example, let's say you want to benchmark the costs that you have for your logistics, right? So then you could say, my logistics costs in the traditional world, you would probably say, let's say my activity is delivering stuff, right? So I can say, how many times do I deliver in the year? So you would make a very complex calculation. You say, maybe I have, I don't know, 1,000 deliveries. Okay, and then you're going to see, well, to which customers will that be? How far away do they have their offices, right? So then you figure out the kilometers, and then you figure out the cost of gasoline, and then you come up with number X, right? So X dollars will be my budget, yeah, for my logistics cost. Yeah. So that's super tedious, super lengthy. It makes really little sense to do it. A much smarter way, this could be, you take ratios and relative numbers. So you just say, what is good performance in my logistics activities? Where you say, well, a good performance is dollars per kilometer. Okay. And then you can say, well, in the last year, I don't know, we had $3 per kilometer was very good cost-efficient operations. Okay. And then if you have it expressed in a ratio like this, the size is basically unimportant, right? Because you can say my logistics operations, I take $3 per kilometer, and then there's this huge big company which in otherwise is not really comparable, but for some reason they managed to have $2 per kilometer, and then maybe that's a good comparison because it doesn't depend on the size, right? So even if the size is an issue, you could probably figure out smartly what could be a good way to still benchmark yourself against that with ratios and relative numbers.
Okay, thank you very much. And then I want to move to the next questions. Could you please give us the best practice example of beyond budgeting adoptions? And then what is the obstacles, and then how to deal with that for successful implementations of beyond budgeting?
Okay, so that's a big question. So I would have to probably talk a bit more about that. So what's a best practice company, right? So yeah. So one company that I was showing here, so maybe I just go back quickly what I also brought for you. So in the slides, which I'm actually happy to share afterwards. So in the book, right, I basically gave you a little pitch of the book in the beginning. So in the book that I showed, there's much more detail on, for example, what I just showed you, right? So what are different ways to set targets, right? So if you do it relatively, what could you do? So for all the principles, there's a lot of detail examples, right? So if you're interested, if anyone is interested in this, I can really recommend that, because it's really rich, right? It gives you lots of examples of how the principles can be lived. How could you practice these principles? Then there's a bit about using and workshopping the map. And then there are some patterns. For example, the better budgeting or zero-based budgeting is a pattern that we described. So that was the question we had before. And then we have some cases. Okay, so now one case is, and I'm going to skip this. So one case is the company Equinor, which is one of the best practice companies. And Equinor is the largest company in Scandinavia. It's a oil and gas company. And now, I mean, this sector is now calling themselves energy companies because they are doing a lot of renewables as well. So Equinor also changed its name to kind of reflect that they are really into renewable energy as well. So they had a struggle, they had a problem of saying our traditional budget had three purposes. So they were really focusing not on the six, but really on three principles and processes only, which is we use the budget to set targets, to forecast, and to allocate resources. And we were really unhappy because there were a lot of conflicting purposes, right? So if I want to set a target, it's typically an ambitious number. So that means it's not realistic. And that's the number I would use for my forecast, for example. Okay. If I ask people, give me your most realistic guess for your sales, but if this number is also a target for them, you will never get a realistic forecast number because people will lowball this number, right? So lots of issues, lots of problems. So they said in Equinor, our way to unlock beyond budgeting, to start this implementation, is to say, okay, let's separate these functions or purposes of the budget and have not one process in fall, but let's have three separate processes. So we're going to have a process in which we will actually figure out what our targets are. Then we have one process, which is our forecast. And then we have a process, which is our resource allocation. And they are decoupled from each other. Okay, so that's one way of doing this. And then they said, okay, once they're decoupled, we don't have conflicting purposes because they're kind of decoupled, they're separate processes. And then I can actually start improving those processes one after the other. So on targets, I can really say, I want to have inspiring goals and targets, really to stretch people, to kind of really push them to say, okay, what can I invent? How can I be really creative? On the forecast, then, they can be extremely unbiased because they're not biased by their target. They're not biased by the resource allocation process. So they can be extremely realistic because that's important. That forecast will really drive my actions to say my forecast is kind of showing me I'm expecting bad performance in the future, which is not what my target tells me. So with this realistic forecast, then I can close then the gap, right? So we have a forecast process which is also limited in detail and has the right frequency and time horizon for my operations. And then on resource allocation, I can also then become extremely performing, right? Because I can really develop this. I can do resources. I can deal with OPEX differently than I can deal with CAPEX. I can be extremely dynamic. So this is one best practice company, and we call this pattern the radical improvement pattern, right? Because this is a pattern that many companies have done. So Equinor, for example, has done this. Then there's a company called Danone, which is maybe you've also heard about them. They make yogurt and water. They're based in France. And Coloplast, which is a Danish medical products company. So they all really like this approach. And they say, okay, this is a great way for us to start with beyond budgeting, because these are the three really, really central functions of budgets. And yeah, this would be my answer to the question of what's the best practice and what's a way to implement this. And this is a good way to start.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very clear explanations. And then there are some questions. The next one is about, in beyond budgeting, we don't mainly rely on fixed financial targets. So does it mean that beyond budgeting implementation complement with the balanced scorecard? Because in the balanced scorecard, we have a non-financial aspects and also financial aspects as well. Thank you.
Yeah. So it's I mean, companies can of course use the idea of a balanced scorecard also as a way to dashboard to measure performance, right? So this is the way the balanced scorecard was invented, right? The idea was obviously to say, okay, we want to be balanced in our scorecard, in our dashboard. We want to look at financial metrics, but also non-financial ones. The customer perspective, internal processes, and learning and growth. So. And that's totally fine. You can do this. You can measure your performance in these balanced ways. The problem starts if a company tries to maybe also budget or set targets on these things, right? Because then they're kind of creating a goal on the balanced scorecard. And then the danger is often that you basically have your budgeting process, and then you use the same in a traditional company, and you use the same logic of the traditional budgeting process onto the balanced scorecard. And then you're budgeting basically your financial metrics, you're budgeting your customers' metrics, and all the others as well, right? And then you are again in this problem of a command and control type of management model, right? So I would be wary of this, right? So I would not kind of in a traditional organization do that and then start budgeting a balanced scorecard, right? That said, you can also, I mean, if the way you use a balanced scorecard, this could be extremely complementary also to beyond budgeting. So this company I'm just showing, Equinor, is actually one of the balanced scorecard Hall of Fame companies when they still had the name Statoil, because they have their approach, which they call ambition to action, right? So this is basically their management tool that they have. And this is a tool that any manager can use if they want to. It's basically a template that exists, which allows them to measure their performance in balanced ways, right? So they actually changed the order of the perspectives, right? They included a risk perspective, and they make it so that it's aligned with their management model, right? So they still use a version of the balanced scorecard, let's say, to be extremely balanced, but they are not using a traditional mindset on it, right? So that would be my answer to that question.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very clear. And then the next question is, you say that a lot, or I mean, you save many advantages or positive effect of beyond budgeting. But is there any actually potential drawbacks for beyond budgeting implementations in the companies?
Potential throwbacks. So, I mean, it depends on eventually, if you do beyond budgeting. I mean, what I try to say is you are reinventing what is the when people, managers feel in control of the organization, right? So I think that's very much about this sort of mindset of people. So if you have a CEO who has a learned behavior, and this is very often the case, right? So people who are in organizations, they grew up with a certain way of managing, right? Because when they started their work, they had a manager who had a way of managing it. Then they had a promotion, and then they had another manager. They had a promotion, and then the CEO of this organization was doing it in this way, right? So in traditional organizations, we grow up by saying we need to have a fixed target in the ground, yeah, and then we need to cascade those targets down into the organization, and the target has to be very, very detailed, and it has to be matched and coupled with a forecast. This has to be matched and coupled with a resource allocation, right? And this is this traditional mindset, right? So it's really it's very difficult for many people to move out of it, to say, okay, I can actually imagine to be in control in different ways. I can actually be in control very much in beyond budgeting. And actually this chart that I showed you right here was invented, let's say, in around 2014. So, and this showed really people that you can be in control in very different ways without having a traditional budget, because you can actually do the same three things that a budget does. You can still set a great target, you can still forecast, you can still allocate resources, but you do it in very different ways. So you need to figure out a way to kind of really make sure that people are still feeling in control of this. And the danger is, and that we've seen that in some implementations, is that, let's say, there's a CEO or some leader who really moves into beyond budgeting because they're really convinced and they feel in control, even with beyond budgeting, or even more in control. So they're in control in the sense that they know where the business is going, they can really steer it, right? They can really create a great management model. But then if this person leaves the company, you have a new employee who comes in from the outside, and this person's management model is, oh, I need to have a fixed stick in the ground, right? The forecast doesn't need to be realistic. They say, this forecast can't be trusted. I don't believe this forecast. Make it a better one, right? So they're very toxic behaviors, very old school ways of doing management. And this, we see that very often, unfortunately, that if we have key positions, key people who move in the organization, that this creates a problem.
Okay, thank you very much. And then the last question is, sometimes companies are not ready enough to move to beyond budgeting because of maybe lack of resources or the regulations. For example, the government still use traditional budgeting. And then the question is that, can we minimize the drawbacks of traditional budgeting without budgeting abandonment?
Yeah, I mean, that maybe goes back to, so the question was, can we minimize the drawbacks of traditional budgeting without abandoning budgeting? So, well, probably not fully, probably you can, because what's crucial, and this is what I really want you to understand, is the traditional budgeting has a consequence on the management model, right? It's really the command and control, right? So if you still do traditional budgeting, you will not just tweak that a little bit and then you go away from command and control, right? So the big elephant, the big problem that we have is the command and control management model, right? So we need to get away from this, right? And we can do this changing both management processes and the leadership side, right? But of course, an attempt that was done in order to kind of minimize the problems was what we had before, this idea of, let's say, better budgeting, where we say, I'm going to tweak a bit my forecasts. I'm going to move to rolling forecasts so that I'm much more oriented towards the future, right? Or in my budgets, I will take away some detail. I don't need to actually plan all my, I don't know, 400 or 500 line items in my budget. I can maybe automatically forecast, maybe using AI or whatever technology to automatically kind of understand what's the development of certain cost items. I can maybe reduce detail and plan clusters, cluster certain line items. So there's a lot of approaches like this, but most of these approaches, what they have in common is they don't help you to get away from the command and control management model, right? So whichever way you tweak the traditional budgeting process, you're not going to go away from a command and control management model that way.
Okay, I'm sorry, there is one questions more. According to your experience, how long does it take for the companies moving to beyond budgeting from the traditional one?
So, I mean, that depends, right? So, I mean, there's, and I can maybe show this. So what I brought for you, there was a few other slides. So actually the viable map in answering the questions is very, very helpful. So there's a lot of cases in the viable map book, for example, that describes also the way you could implement this, right? So one way of doing this would be you can do a radical change, right? Where you say, okay, we are at a deadlock here. We are dead end. We need to really radically change something. And sometimes you find this in implementations where you say, we were like this now, but in 5 months, we're totally different, right? So that's very radical. And then this can go fast, right? But of course, this is a big effort of the organization to really make this, make everyone understand that, right? So another way is you could say what I used before as a metaphor, the idea of a journey, right? Where you say, I know what is my end goal. I know I want to go towards beyond budgeting, but I will not do it radically right away. So I will maybe start what I showed you, the approach of Equinor, where we say we're going to change 3 practices for now: target setting, resource allocation, and forecasting. And this could be done very quickly, right? So this could be done within a few months, and then you'll be very much surprised. So if you do it this way, you will really unlock a lot of thinking without really driving the implementation yourself, because people all of a sudden realize, oh, there's a relative target. So that means I can kind of do lots of different things to kind of try to understand how to reach that relative target, right? Or resource allocation is dynamic all of a sudden. So it means whenever I have a new cool project coming along, I can get money now, right? And then if it's not working, I give some money back. Right, so people realize that's a big message, how this little tweak and change in your management processes really changes a lot on the leadership side, right? So in implementing, maybe think about what could be little hacks, ways of doing things, so that this really makes people think that now there is a new, different management model. So as always in organizational change, there are different, outcomes. I mentioned you can be radical, you can be on a long-term journey, but then it's important that you kind of don't forget what your end goal is, what principles you want to manage for, right? And then, I mean, you have lots of challenges along the way. So it's very difficult to say it takes X amount of time. What I can say is, however, that you can get support from consulting organizations, but you shouldn't have consultants do that for you, right? Because we're talking about a management model. So it's really, it's the guts of your organization. It's really who you are as an organization. So you cannot have a consultant do that for you because you want to speed it up. So you can have support by them, they can guide you and so on and so forth, but it has to be really coming from you, right? So you can't take a shortcut by hiring consultants.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a very clear explanation and answer. So this is the last questions for the first part. The next, we can move to the second part. Over to you, Sebastian Becker.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, Dewi. So great questions so far. It's very fun to discuss them with you. So thanks for that. So as I was answering, I was already kind of flipping through some additional slides that I have. So, but these are basically around, the model and the book, right? So the more the practical insights. So I was already, and maybe I could, I think I mentioned this, so I will maybe just say there's a few patterns which are interesting, and this relates to the second part of the presentation, which is about research. How can we research this, right? So some of the patterns that we have in the book, patterns, so we've tested and tried the book, right? So we didn't just kind of write the book and here it is, but we said, okay, we know a lot of things already about beyond budgeting. We came up with this idea, we then did some workshops and we tested this and we tried to derive patterns, okay? So I brought a few of these patterns for you. And this is, if you are researching this could also be something you encounter empirically. You see an organization, you're researching this, you're seeing that where you discover this pattern. So One pattern here, we call that the frustrated transformation. Okay, so if you go back to this visual right here, frustrated transformation is basically, we see this very often. You have, let's say, a CEO or something, or HR who says, oh, we have to have a new purpose for the organization. Yeah, we have to be very successful in hiring the new talent, and talents, well, they are Generation Z, they're Theory Y people. So maybe our goal is to attract them through having a great purpose of the organization. We also want to do really good in society. We want to be net positive or whatnot. So we're going to move in this direction. So you see the below pattern that the yellow posters are very much towards a distributed way of managing, but nobody actually adjusted the management process up top. So that leads to frustration because there's misalignment, right? So that's one, well, pattern that we see, right? So frustrated transformation. Another one is the famous say-do gap. Yeah? So you could be in an organization where people, leaders, say great things about the culture, about the organization, like, oh, we have this amazing purpose, and look, we are so decentralized. Our teams can make lots of decisions. This is what they say, yeah, in maybe a video, a company video, or the flashy company intranet. But if you actually sit in a meeting with the same people, they are doing something very different. They take all the decisions. So there's no empowerment. They say there's empowerment, but there's not, because they take all the decisions. Or they say there's this great purpose, but then they say, well, where is our, where is the goal? Why didn't you reach it, right? So there's a big say and do gap. So that's another famous pattern that we have discovered. Then, I mean, we talked about this, right? So this is basically the idea of better budgeting, right? Of trying to say, we're going to do forecasts 4 times per year, and we're going to, I don't know, change our rewards a little bit, right? And so on and so forth, right? So this is just typically leading to doing budgeting more and more often. So you probably have much more dissatisfaction as well. So that's another big, well, a negative pattern, yeah? Or stretching targets. That's oftentimes, some people say we can solve any problem just by adjusting the way we set targets, right? Let's just give a bit of a stretch target, right? But that's another pattern. We say, well, that doesn't work, because if it's only the target that changes, but the forecast doesn't, or the resource allocation, well, you're probably not going to go anywhere. Same thing with just changing forecasts. Yeah. So also in research, we have a lot of papers that we see in research that say they are studying beyond budgeting, and then they only look at forecasts. They say, well, this company has a rolling forecast, so that's beyond budgeting, right? But that's what I try to show you. No, beyond budgeting means you would have to change and really work on the entire management model. So just changing the forecast is not beyond budgeting. Yeah? So these would be some patterns. So so that's that part. So I will share this presentation. So if you're interested in the viable map, so there's also a website where you can also get basically a short sample. So you can download a few pages from the book and get a feeling for what the book is. There's also a worksheet you can download. So if you now feel inspired, where you say, oh, I want to do a viable map for my organization, what is my management model? So you can download this worksheet and then kind of put post-its there and diagnose your own management model, maybe also diagnose a new one, right? So feel free to take a screenshot of this to then maybe kind of download this short sample. Yeah? So this leads me over to the second part of the presentation, which is future research directions. So how could we research this? So, and researchers, I'm assuming in the audience, we have maybe some people who are doing a bachelor thesis, a master thesis. We also have faculty, professors who are maybe doing some research on this as well. So I'll probably just start by saying what has currently been done in research. So, and I'm using here also actually the viable map, because I think now you should be understanding the logic of this visualization. Yeah. So in research, we have a current, which we can call broadly contingency theory, right? So we are thinking at, okay, what contingencies exist for organizations out there, right, that determine the way we do something inside the organization. So contingency theory is basically, it's in all over management research. We are looking at this. And in the accounting and management control literature, we also have this when it's about, well, how do we budget? How do we work? What's our management control system? So we have this contingency theory research, right? Where we say we have a construct like task uncertainty, POI, like perceived environmental uncertainty, culture, sometimes leadership climate, strategy, right? So this is a research that was very big, let's say in the 70s, 80s, 90s. There's not too much maybe right now any longer, but this was basically interesting because in terms of management model, this was trying to give us some answers about how does the environmental context determine, influence, moderate, mediate what we do in the management model, and the same thing on the people side, right? So there is some work on this. So if you decide to research beyond budgeting, I mean, this could be a good good resources to look into to say, what do we already know about how these contingency factors take effect on our management models. Second, we have a lot of, let's say, traditional budgeting literature, right? So this is people who are basically studying, researchers, studying companies which have a very traditional budgeting system, okay? So this means, as we said, that these companies are basically studying the very left position here on the viable map, right? So then you can recognize that by reading these papers now, you can actually see, okay, what type of position is this research study assuming or studying, right? So there's a big current of research that's called the reliance on accounting performance measures, or in short, the RAPM literature. And this was started in the 70s and 80s. And this is heavily focused on, as I mentioned, a very fixed, not really management model. It's really a focus only on the management processes. Yeah, and it has a big focus on target setting and performance evaluation, right? So related to this, there's a big stream which is called participatory budgeting, right? So the question is, should I have very top-down budgets as a process, very maybe command and control, or should people be able to say in the budgeting process what they believe is the right sales number, the right costs, right? So this sounds like empowerment, but oftentimes, I mean, this is a participatory budgeting. I mean, there's a lot of iterations, and in the end, it's the top who that wins. But there's a lot of studying research in this participatory budgeting, because it's interesting from a theory point of view, right, to study these things. But what we can comment on altogether is that traditional literature, that if you, like, I don't know, research budgeting research, let's say in Scopus and Science Direct, a lot of the papers that you get there are very much focused on one or two practices of budgeting, and they're only looking at the management processes always, right? So they don't really look at entire management models. So the traditional literature is not really a good, area where you can find, comprehensive studies of the management model. So at the same time, you have some work that is really trying to research the phenomenon of beyond budgeting as such, right? So it's really straight on. Yeah. So what is beyond budgeting? How does it work? So here I put down the papers that you have. So we have most work here is basically a single case study, right? So this is the 2011 paper right here, studying a large Nordic organization. Same with this paper. I did also a long study with 4 different companies in the Germany, Austria, Switzerland area. Then we have another paper right here that's comparing one of the previous companies with another one. And then we have one from Oceania, the last paper right here. So these are really case studies, right? So qualitative work where people actually follow organizations in a qualitative way, in a single case study, multiple case study, to really understand, okay, these are organizations who are really having a full beyond budgeting model. Some of them are a bit focused, let's say, on management processes. Some are trying to be a bit broader, including leadership principles. But again, I mean, these are the traditions. These authors are all people from management accounting and management control. And oftentimes they kind of mainly talk about management processes. In my paper, I try to really talk a lot about the leadership principles as well. That's also, I guess, because I was really visiting a lot the Beyond Budgeting roundtable meetings. So I think that's crucial, right? So in the literature, we can say this in general, we are lacking really this idea of a management model. So we should not say, if I study Beyond Budgeting, I can only do this by looking at the management process. But this is a big problem, a big bias in the literature altogether, right? So that already, if you're planning a future project, now that you understood that Beyond Budgeting is really the whole management model, think about how you can capture this, how you can look at this. So then there is a further existing research which kind of looks at several related concepts. So there's a stream of work that looks at the functions of budgets. So you see these papers right here. I already mentioned that budgets serve many functions. We have the 6 principles. The management principles is basically what a budget fulfills. To condense it, we said a budget is for target setting, for forecasting, for resource allocation. So there's work that actually studies, well, what do companies do? How do they use budgets? And that's interesting, because if you talk about decoupling these functions, well, this kind of work will be very relevant, right? So if you want to study that, you can also use this work to kind of look at the categorizations of functions. So in the paper I published, for example, we find through a factor analysis these 3 factors, right? Target setting, target setting and performance evaluation, forecasting, and resource allocation. Then there is some work that studies some aspects of the model in isolation. Yeah, here I would be careful, because this is also a negative pattern in the viable map that we saw, right? So we shouldn't do research where we say, I'm going to just look at forecasts and forecasting and then claim that I'm studying Beyond Budgeting, right? So of course, it's totally fine to study forecasts, but if you just do forecasts, you're not immediately a Beyond Budgeting company, right? So this shouldn't be misunderstood, right? So just, well, word of caution there, right? So there is some work that has mentioned this. They say, oh, we're looking at this forecasting company, so now we learn about Beyond Budgeting. So, well, you need to say why you learn about Beyond Budgeting, or show that it's more complex than that. So you're not Beyond Budgeting just because you do a forecast. So then there's other work, the Solbach et al. Paper right here that looks at what happens if we move away from individual variable bonuses to team-based bonuses and no variable bonus, and team-based performance evaluation, no variable bonus anymore. So very crucial and interesting insights of Beyond Budgeting that could be studied with quantitative methodology. So this could be an interesting avenue for further research as well, right? Then you could, and there was one question that you all had, was about how do I implement this, right? So that's a study I did, for example, really understanding how can I deinstitutionalize this way of thinking, this mindset of saying, I need to have a fixed stick in the ground, right? So how can I get away from this, right? So what are the challenges in implementing this, right? One big challenge could also be, well, a management model, if it consists of processes and leadership principles, how can I combine maybe the finance function with the HR function, with the leadership, right? So these are topics that are still unexplored. So this could be done. Then, of course, because Beyond Budgeting is a management innovation, you can also take an angle of looking at the diffusion of innovations. So how often is this being practiced? Who does that? Why does the innovation look the way it looks today? Who has influenced it? How has this happened? What's the dynamics of core players, of peripheral players, as in our paper? Or what is the dynamics of the supply side and the demand side of innovations, as in the AX and AX paper? Then there's also surveys on Beyond Budgeting. There's 2 big surveys, the Libby-Lindsay survey in 2010. So they actually was very comprehensive about a lot of things about budgeting, including dissatisfaction. So dissatisfaction with the current way of budgeting as a motivation, perhaps, to go elsewhere. So in this survey, however, they only asked, are you planning to abandon, right? So they only said, do you plan to abandon budgets? Yes or no, right? So I think I tried to say that it's not so easy to say Beyond Budgeting is, it's not a black and white question, 0 or 1, right? It's much more complex, right? So if you want to grasp and capture Beyond Budgeting in a survey, you should be much more sophisticated, right? Because, I mean, beyond budgeting, if we think it's 12 principles, you have to really capture this complexity. You cannot just say, are you a beyond budgeting company? Yes or no, right? Then you're not going to get good results because, yeah, some companies even, they are beyond budgeting from the outside, but they don't call it like this on the inside. So because they have their own way of talking about their management model. So then maybe you have a respondent who knows really well their own model, but they forget that we call it beyond budgeting from the outside, right? So then you also don't get anywhere, right? So capturing this in a survey is kind of challenging. Yeah, the recent survey by Matejka et al. That just appeared is pretty comprehensive, right? It's trying to really do that, to say, okay, what are companies doing there? Some are maybe beyond budgeting, some are not. But so they did a really comprehensive survey to try to capture this. Yeah? So you see there's next to studying really the entire and whole model, there are also some sub-streams in the literature that kind of could potentially tell us something about beyond budgeting and in particular ways. And of course, here we have, maybe you're familiar with this distinction between what's a method theory and a domain theory, right? So a domain theory would really be studying the phenomenon, knowing a lot about beyond budgeting, and a method theory would be using also some social theories to kind of make sense of what happens in your empirics, right? So now there's a body of research really on beyond budgeting. So there's this domain of beyond budgeting is building up, but you can basically only do this type of research, or you can also kind of add some more social theories to kind of make sense of your finding. So maybe last slide on some additional future research before we have some more questions. So I mean, I ordered this in terms of methodologies. So this could be qualitative or quantitative. Yeah, both would be possible to study this. So really honing down on making sure so how can we understand what's this command and control management, right? So model, so and then including obviously management processes and leadership principles. So this dissatisfaction, how does it show in organizations? What are the consequences of this? What's the problem for an organization if it's too much command and control? Maybe they miss a lot of opportunities on the market. They are underperforming. People are stressed. They have a lot of turnover, right? So we don't know a lot about that, right? So these traditional companies, what's the problem when you have a command and control management model? Yeah, then in a very much kind of domain theory thinking, so really practice driven, well, still studying the entire model, right? So that can be interesting, just really saying what does it look like, and really the entire model, right? Not studying it in isolation, but really as an entire model. Third, I mean, maybe some of you are familiar with this literature. In the management accounting and control literature, you have the management control systems as a package point of view, where you say the way we do control in organizations is always as a package. We had a question from the audience which said balanced scorecard and budgets, right? So you can say, well, they are forming a sort of package in an organization. So what is the interrelation between these elements of control? How do they work together, right? So, and in beyond budgeting, I mean, this is a big package as well. It's a management model is per se, it's a package, right? So you can actually take this angle to study beyond budgeting this way. Yeah. Or I mentioned to you this radical improvement pattern where I said this is what Equinor does, what Danone does, what Coloplast does, and many others, right? So this is kind of one big, let's say, substream of companies, and this could be also further studied as such, right? So how can you start beyond budgeting in this particular way? So this could be an interesting avenue to do research. Then focusing very much on only qualitative methodologies. What we observe a lot in the beyond budgeting community is a lot of people coming towards the community because, and I mentioned this, they are on an agile transformation. So they want to become very digital as a company. They want to be in an agile transformation. You also will have a very different leadership model. Yeah, you will actually not tell people how they should be doing things. So you're really having an empowerment in these organizations. You're very decentralized. You're extremely transparent. So very similar principles, right? So what's the relation to a company maybe going on an agile transformation because they are extremely digital, they want to be very agile, and then changing their management model somehow. So this could be a very interesting thing to study. Also, companies that are on the purpose, let's say, train. So where they say, oh, we're going to have a new purpose, and not mostly, if you want to have a purpose, you typically realize very quickly that the way you set targets is kind of not in alignment with this, right? So same thing, if you're really a purpose-oriented company, well, what's your management model, right? This could be very interesting. And similarly for sustainability, if you're very sustainable, right? So how can you design a management model that allows you to be more sustainable? So just recently I read a book on the company Unilever. It's called Net Positive. And as I was reading the book, I was basically creating a viable map of this company. And this was quite aligned. So I was very interested in this and kind of studying these in relations with these big phenomena and topics. Second topic would also be the role of controllers. So if you take away the budget, you have beyond budgeting. So how does that change the role of the finance people in the organization? Controllers, the CFO, other people, because we know also that a lot of these people will have a much better job because they don't have to do all this planning in detail and doing variance analysis, but they are much more forward-looking. So how could changing this way of managing change the identity and roles of these people in the firm? Thirdly, what's also very interesting, and I highlighted this, is really the idea of when a manager is feeling in control. So when this may have to do with power, yielding power. I want to yield power. That's why I'm going to do command and control. So how can we kind of understand this better? If I move beyond budgeting, how do these people maybe still feel in control? Do they still exercise power, or is it a certain type of manager that you have here, right? So these would be very interesting questions. Lastly, you can also study the performance question in a quantitative methodology, right? Which is a bit difficult. I mean, because it's a management model. That means it's kind of all over the organization. So you have to empirically somehow capture this all over of the organization and then make a claim that this leads to better performance. We now have 2 small surveys by consulting firms that say there is a lot of performance effects, but I mean, this is just consulting work. So by BCG and Bain. But I mean, this is not a rigorous, let's say, test on this, right? So this could also be interesting. A lot of people obviously always ask, well, is this performing or not? A bit of issues right here. What's important, right? So if you try to capture beyond budgeting, don't ask, do you do it or not? So 0 or 1, that's not a good way to do it because it's much more complex than this. Really try to read some of the recent books and really try to engage with what is beyond budgeting to really see what is a management model. And I tried to give you a flavor of this today in my presentation, that you really have, if you want to research this, that you really understand what's at stake and what are the big problems. So not studying this in isolation. And also going a lot on the contingencies or back to those contingencies, because there was some work already in our field. So really understanding the environment better, how is that an influence on the management model, and also the types of people that you have. So this would be some ideas for future research. And now I'll open the floor again for some questions, and maybe Dewi can again moderate this. You did a great job before, so I look forward to having some questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Becker. That's a very interesting explanations. There are some questions here from the participants. The first question is that if I want to conduct a survey, how to gather the data for valid beyond budgeting adopter? Is there any database, maybe?
Yeah, that's a challenge, right? So because, well, we don't know from the outside what's a beyond budgeting company, right? So as I mentioned, I mean, either you are a beyond budgeting company because you started this, you wanted to do this, but there are also firms which are beyond budgeting without knowing it, right? So they just never had this command and control culture because there was a founder, a family or whatever, and they always had their own way of doing this. I studied these firms as well myself. So oftentimes, I mean, they are unusual. So you can maybe come up with them because you hear about them. It's a different way of management. And then you can see that and you can maybe study that management model for themselves. But there is no database where you can download stuff, or that doesn't exist. But I mean, you can still do a survey and ask in a population of companies that you survey, beyond budgeting related questions, and then say, what would be my assessment? Maybe along the variable map, you can say they have a very fixed management processes, or more continuous relative stages or whatnot. So there's no database.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very clear. And then move to the next questions. What do you think when a company chooses to implement beyond budgeting, will there be a certain influence on investors or stakeholders? Maybe is there any effect on the market or investors' decision?
Yep. Yeah, that's a good question. Some that I get very often. So a lot of people in organizations say, no, I have to do budgeting because I'm a public company. Yeah, so people think there is an automated connection between I'm a listed company and my investors. They want a budget, as if the investors care how you get managed inside, right? So I think investors care about performance, but they don't care about how you manage yourself, right? So a lot of people have this excuse of saying, I need to do budgets because I have investors. And this is a big fallacy. We even in the book, we have 2 pages dedicated fully on this. Yeah. So why we say that's not necessary. You can be beyond budgeting, and investors will love that because you're actually more performing, right? You have an empowered culture, so your people are much more happy. And there is a way to kind of just move into your data that you have, and then still provide guidance if you need, even though that's never a good idea, perhaps, and kind of report to the markets and to other stakeholders, including banks, and including, one mentioned this in one question previously, the government, right? So just because you're in the government, that doesn't mean you can't do beyond budgeting, right? So these people, these stakeholders typically have an information need. They want 1 or 2 things about what do you think will the future look like? Where is this going? But you don't need to kind of pollute the entire organization by cascading these ideas down. To answer the question, where is this going? What are you going to do? You can do this really well with a beyond budgeting model. So that I find is extremely interesting, because that's a big block of people's mind. So this could be also researched very well to understand the relation between, let's say, top management and the markets about the management models they have.
Okay, thank you very much. And then the next question is that can we combine the beyond budgeting techniques with other concepts such as risk-based budgeting? So I would warn against doing this zero-based budgeting. So we actually also have a pattern like this, and I quickly showed that in the presentation. So zero-based budgeting, essentially what you do is you say, okay, we assume there was no budget in the past. We're just going to say, well, we want to understand what resources would we need today in order to fulfill our mission, our function. The way zero-based budgeting is practiced is that you're doing budgeting from the ground, from zero, but it's still a highly command and control type of management model. In fact, some zero-based budgeting implementations imply that it's 2 people who have to sign off a particular expense, right? So it's oftentimes a much more bureaucratic. So it's even bureaucracy or command and control on times 2. So you can combine it with zero-based budgeting at all. It's a very opposing kind of mindset typically. But the question was, can you combine it with other things, right? So I mentioned already the idea of agile, right? Agility, purpose, sustainability. So these could be candidates to study interrelations with. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much, Becker. And then the next question is dealing with beyond budgeting implementation in public sector organization. I think it's very challenging because in Indonesian case, our government, as far as I know, is still using traditional budgeting than beyond budgeting. Could you please give us maybe example for the governments maybe in other countries applying this beyond budgeting and they are successful?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, there's a subgroup of government and non-profit entities inside beyond budgeting. So these are people who are exchanging how I can use this and do this in the government. So to make it short, that's feasible, that's doable. So you can do that. And I mean, we have a lot of examples like this in Sweden. I have a colleague in the BBRT who is very much involved in doing even consulting projects with public sector organizations in doing beyond budgeting. And again, what I mentioned is oftentimes the government, the ministry, they have some information need, right? But they don't tell you that you have to do it in this particular way, right? So you can decouple this, right? If you have your government entity, the way you manage your entity, it can be completely decoupled with what the ministry perhaps wants, right? So there are some numbers and information needs that you have to give them. But if you can develop a system, you just have to think about, well, how can I decouple? How can I still satisfy the information needs of the ministry or the upper entity, the higher entity, whilst still having a very empowered management model, right? And so that's totally feasible. We also have non-profits, right? So Human Rights Watch, for example, is a big organization that is doing beyond budgeting, right? And they also, you can say, they have funding organizations. This is a governments as well. So they are also doing beyond budgeting, even though you can say they are funded by governments.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very clear. And then the last question is dealing with sustainability. The question is that how sustainable is that beyond budgeting implementation? Is there any failed case? So the companies have already moved to the beyond budgeting, and then wow, it's very difficult. Then they move. They go back to the traditional one. And what do you think? What's driving this failure of implementation?
Yeah, that's a good question. So just to make sure for everyone, the word sustainability here doesn't mean sustainability in environmental sense or social, right? It's sustainability of the approach, right? So how long does it survive in the organization? Huh? So I mentioned earlier that we have some cases where companies actually go back, right? And that's typically, I think the most frequent pattern is you have a new top manager joining the company who doesn't understand it. They don't get it, right? And then they will sit in meetings and management meetings and say, I don't believe this forecast. This forecast is not good enough, right? So then they kind of have an unrealistic forecast, which was what we need in beyond budgeting. And then they kind of change the forecast and make it a goal. And then all of a sudden, people interpret the forecast as a goal, as a target I have to reach. And they start to game this forecast, right? And then you have fixed goals in the ground. So it's very polluting, right? So you really have to shield the organization from it. There's a great example of this where the company Svenska Handelsbanken, which is one of the biggest cases of beyond budgeting. So, and everybody really understands the management model there. So this is a story that you can read up in Financial Times, where there was a new CEO who came in from the outside who didn't really understand the management model. And then he kind of introduced a more traditional command and control management model in his first actions. But then the board, so the supervisory board actually made sure this person left again because they said this person clearly didn't understand our management model, right? So, so there are companies that even survive this threat. But the biggest threat, I would say, is really people don't understand this model. So it's really about education, making this clear, making this understandable. And I believe the Viable Map can really do a good job here because it visualizes the management model. So you really understand that. So if then somebody comes in and pulls the post-it back to the left somehow, you can easily see and diagnose there's a problem. This is not going down well. So previously there was no Viable Map, so we couldn't really visualize this that easily, but now actually that's possible, right? So yeah, most failure cases are really this. We've also had, there's one case also where they thought in crisis. So if I'm doing my normal business, I implement beyond budgeting, but then there's a big crisis. So oftentimes when companies are in crisis, the reaction is that we are pulling the reins, right? We are centralizing the firm a lot. Yeah, and then one company said, oh, because there's a crisis, I have to stop beyond budgeting. Yeah, and that's also not the best thinking, perhaps, because we have also lots of examples where companies in crisis actually faring much better, are much more performing if they have beyond budgeting because they have dynamic resource allocation. Because then they can stop projects very quickly. Yeah, they don't overinvest in projects. They have a process in place where they can stop any investment. Then they also have forecasts, so they can really understand much better into the future what's the impact of the crisis on the organization, so that they're much more reactive actually. Yeah, so again, it's the wrong personnel in the top management positions and crisis. So these would be two reasons for failures sometimes.
Okay, thank you very much. I think there are no more questions again. Maybe any participants here, do you want to ask directly to Becker? Please unmute yourself and then deliver your questions. Okay, I think there is no more questions. Okay, Becker, thank you very much. We have come to the end part of this lecture today. I would like to say thank you very much for Becker and also for Becker, especially for the valuable and also interesting insight today. And for participants, I would like to remind you to fill out the questionnaire and also the attendance form. And before closing our lecture today, I would like to wrapping up our lecture today. So beyond budgeting is the concept which encourages the company to abandon the traditional budgeting because they have so many drawbacks and focus on the adaptive management process. However, of course, the adopting of this BB requires some readiness for the companies itself. So if your companies interested to apply or implement budgeting, don't hesitate to contact the consultants. They will help you. They will guide you to move from the traditional budgeting to the modern one or beyond budgeting. And then for the future research suggestions, there are a lot of parts that you can examine, both in quantitative and also qualitative way. For instance, you can relate beyond budgeting with dissatisfactions from traditional budgeting, and then you will getting more empirical evidence on the relationship maybe with between beyond budgeting and also performance, or maybe the effect on the market and etc. Okay, this is the wrapping up of our today's lecture. Thank you very much, Becker. It's a very great lecture today. So for participants, also thank you very much, and have a nice day. Good afternoon and good morning for Sebastian Becker. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Yeah,
Have a good afternoon.
bye-bye.
Good evening.
Yeah.